The diplomatic vessel Endeavour hung in the darkness of space like a silver needle against the vast canvas of stars. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge with his arms crossed and his jaw tight. Beside him stood Lisa Grant, the chief diplomatic officer who had served humanity's interests at the Galactic Council for almost a decade. Her face showed the same exhaustion that Jake felt deep in his bones. Through the massive viewport before them stretched the Galactic Council station, a structure so enormous it seemed to bend reality itself. Thousands of ships from hundreds of worlds docked at its spiraling arms. The station orbited Zorathis Prime, a world that had served as the political center of known space for millennia. Jake had visited this place 47 times in the past 15 years. Every single time he had left with empty promises. Lisa held a datapad in her hands. The screen displayed the latest response from the Council regarding humanity's petition for full membership. Her fingers trembled slightly as she read it again, though she had already memorized every word. The message was short and dismissive, just like all the others before it. Jake turned to face his diplomatic officer. His voice came out steady despite the anger building in his chest. Lisa looked up at him with tired eyes. She had believed in the process longer than anyone else on the human diplomatic team. She had argued that patience and persistence would eventually win the Council over. Now even she could no longer hide her disappointment. The timeline of humanity's service to the Council played through Jake's mind like a recording he could not stop. 15 years ago, humanity had made first contact with the Galactic Council through a chance encounter near the Outer Rim. The Council had been fighting a brutal war against an aggressive species called the Kraith. The Kraith were expanding rapidly and destroying everything in their path. The Council was losing badly. Humanity had been offered provisional membership in exchange for military assistance. The terms seemed fair at the time. Fight alongside the Council, prove humanity's value, and gain full membership with all its rights and protections. President Helen Carter had signed the agreement with hope for humanity's future among the stars. Human forces had thrown themselves into the war with characteristic determination. The United Earth Fleet had deployed 60% of its military strength to the front lines. Human Marines had fought in trenches on frozen worlds and burning deserts. Human pilots had flown missions that Council species considered suicide runs. Human engineers had rebuilt shattered infrastructure on dozens of planets. Human doctors had saved millions of lives. The Kraith War had dragged on for 12 brutal years. Humanity had lost 300,000 soldiers. The memorials back on Earth stretched for kilometers. Every family in the United Nations had been touched by the sacrifice in some way. But humans had kept their word. They had stood beside their Council allies even when the cost seemed unbearable. 2 years ago, the tide of the war had finally turned. Human tactical innovations and stubborn refusal to retreat had broken the Kraith advance. The enemy had been pushed back beyond the Outer Rim. The Council worlds were safe again. Victory had come at a terrible price, paid mostly in human blood. With the war won, humanity had expected the Council to honor their agreement. President Carter had formally requested full membership status. The response had been a polite delay. The Council needed time to process the request. There were procedures to follow. Humanity would need to be patient. Months had turned into years. Each petition received the same answer with slightly different words. More time was needed. More proof was required. Perhaps in the future, when humanity had matured as a species, full membership could be considered. The message was always wrapped in diplomatic language, but the meaning was clear. Humanity was useful but not equal. Jake had attended Council sessions where human contributions were ignored or minimized. He had watched Councillor Drex of Valorn, one of the most powerful members of the Council, speak about humanity as if they were children playing at civilization. The Valorans were an ancient species that had been part of the Council for thousands of years. They saw themselves as the natural leaders of galactic society. Drex had made his opinion of humanity very clear during the last Council session. Jake remembered every word. The Valorian councillor had stood at his podium with his tall frame, radiating aristocratic superiority. His voice had filled the chamber with casual contempt. Humanity should be grateful for the opportunity to serve the galactic community. Perhaps in another century or two, they might be ready for junior membership. Until then, they should focus on learning from their betters. The other elder species had nodded in agreement. The Therians with their bureaucratic obsession for procedure, the Korthaxi with their rigid sense of hierarchy. The younger species had remained silent, knowing that speaking up would accomplish nothing. The council was ruled by the ancient powers, and they had no intention of sharing that power with aggressive young humans. Lisa finally spoke, breaking the silence on the bridge. Her voice was quiet but steady. She said they had done everything the council asked. Humanity had proven itself in battle. They had shared technology freely. They had mediated disputes between council species. They had asked for nothing except the respect they had earned. Jake nodded slowly. He had made his decision hours ago, but he had wanted to give Lisa time to reach the same conclusion. The time for patience had ended. Humanity had debased itself long enough, begging for recognition from species who would never see them as equals. He activated the communication system that connected directly to the council chamber. The faces of hundreds of counselors appeared on screens throughout the Endeavor's bridge. Counselor Drex sat at the center of the assembly in his elevated seat. His expression showed mild annoyance at the interruption. Jake stood straight and spoke clearly. His words carried across space to the council chamber and to every human ship and station in the galaxy. He thanked the council for the opportunity to serve alongside them. He acknowledged the friendships that had formed between humans and many council species. Then he delivered the message that would change everything. Humanity was formally withdrawing from the Galactic Council, effective immediately. All human military forces would return to human space within 30 days. All diplomatic personnel would depart. All human advisors, engineers, doctors, and teachers serving on council worlds would come home. Humanity would maintain peaceful relations with all species, but they would no longer participate in council affairs or operations. The council chamber erupted in chaos. Dozens of counselors began speaking at once. Drex called for order, but his voice was drowned out by the noise. Some counselors looked shocked. Others appeared angry. A few seemed uncertain, as if they could not quite believe what they had just heard. Jake continued speaking, his voice cutting through the confusion. He explained that humanity had tried to work within the council system. They had followed every rule and met every requirement, but dignity and self-respect were not negotiable. Humanity would no longer accept being treated as servants rather than partners. Counselor Drex finally restored order to the chamber. His expression had shifted from annoyance to something that might have been concern. He suggested that Captain Morrison was being hasty. Perhaps there had been misunderstandings. The council valued humanity's contributions. Surely they could discuss this matter calmly. Jake's response was simple and final. There was nothing left to discuss. Humanity's decision was made. He wished the council well in their future endeavors. Then he terminated the connection. The bridge of the Endeavor fell silent. Lisa stood beside her captain with tears running down her face, though whether they were tears of sadness or relief even she could not say. Jake placed a hand on her shoulder. They had done the right thing. History would prove that. Across the galaxy, human forces began receiving their orders. The withdrawal had begun. The fortress world of Kellis IV sat on the edge of council space like a sentinel guarding against the darkness. For 3 years, this rocky planet had been the front line against Kraith incursions. Human Marines had dug into the red soil and held the line when every tactical analysis said they should retreat. Commander Ryan Blake stood in the main courtyard of Firebase Sentinel and watched his soldiers prepare to leave. The base hummed with activity as Marines packed equipment into transport containers. Defensive turrets that had protected this position for years were being dismantled. The shield generators that had saved countless lives were being powered down. Everything humanity had built here would be left behind. Ryan had received clear orders from Earth. Take nothing that cannot be easily transported. Leave the infrastructure intact. Withdraw with dignity. A group of Kellian civilians stood near the main gate watching the humans work. The Kellians were a peaceful species with gray skin and large eyes that showed emotion more clearly than words ever could. They had lived under the protection of human forces since the Kraith first threatened their world. Now they watched their protectors prepare to abandon them. Lieutenant Amy Foster walked past Ryan carrying a crate of personal belongings. Our uniform was dusty from 3 years of service in harsh conditions. She had arrived on Kellis IV fresh from the academy with idealistic notions about making a difference in the galaxy. The war had aged her, but it had not broken her spirit. Ryan could see the conflict in her eyes as she glanced at the Kellyan families near the gate. Amy had spent her off-duty hours teaching Kellyan children about mathematics and engineering. She had helped them build a small school using human construction techniques. The children had named it Foster Hall in her honor. Now she would leave and probably never see those children again. The thought clearly pained her, but orders were orders. One of the Kellyan elders approached the gate. His name was Torvin, and he had served as the liaison between human forces and the local population. He spoke the human language with a heavy accent but with surprising fluency. Torvin asked if there was any way to convince the humans to stay. His people needed them. The Kraith would return once the humans left, and the Kellyans had no way to defend themselves. Ryan felt the weight of that question settle on his shoulders. He explained that the decision had been made far above his rank. Humanity was withdrawing from all Council operations. The Council itself would need to provide for Kellis IV's defense. Torvin's expression showed despair. The Council had provided minimal support even when humans were here. With humans gone, the Kellyans expected nothing. Amy approached Torvin and placed a hand on the elder's shoulder. She promised that humans would remember Kellis IV. The friendships formed here were real. But humanity could not continue serving those who refused to respect them. Torvin understood, even though understanding brought no comfort. He thanked Amy for everything she had done for his people. Then he turned and walked back to the other Kellyans with his head lowered. Across the galaxy, similar scenes played out on dozens of worlds. On the research station Helix 9, Dr. Paul Chen supervised the packing of advanced medical equipment. The station orbited a Valorian colony world where a terrible plague had killed millions over the past 5 years. Paul and his team had been working 18-hour days searching for a cure. They were close, perhaps only months away from a breakthrough. The Valorian scientists working alongside the human team were devastated by the news of the withdrawal. They begged Paul to request an exception. This work was too important to abandon. Lives hung in the balance. Paul agreed completely, which made the situation even harder. He had sent multiple requests up the chain of command asking to be allowed to finish the research. Every request had been denied. The head of the Valorian research team was an elderly scientist named Corvus. He had initially been skeptical of human medical knowledge, viewing humanity as too young to make meaningful contributions. Working with Paul had changed his mind. Human approaches to medicine were unconventional but remarkably effective. They thought about problems in ways that ancient species had stopped considering millennia ago. Corvus stood in the laboratory watching Paul's team dismantle their equipment. His voice shook as he asked how the Valorians were supposed to continue the research without human guidance. Paul pulled up the complete research files on a datapad and handed it to Corvus. Everything was there. All the data, all the experimental protocols, all the theoretical work. Corvus accepted the pad, but they both knew it was not enough. Understanding the research was different from being able to advance it. Paul apologized sincerely. He wished things were different. Corvus nodded slowly. He said he understood that this was not Paul's choice. The Council had failed humanity. Now everyone would pay the price for that failure. On the industrial world of Prax, human logistics coordinator Karen White stood in a massive warehouse that stretched for kilometers. The building was filled with supplies destined for 17 different Council worlds. Food, medicine, construction materials, spare parts for ships and stations. The complex distribution network had taken years to establish and optimize. Karen's team had made it run with precision. That amazed the bureaucratic Therians who nominally oversaw the operation. The Praxian overseer was a Therian named Vexen, who had worked with Karen since the beginning. He was reviewing the distribution schedules with growing anxiety. His mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of stress in his species. Vexen asked who would manage the network after the humans left. Karen explained as gently as possible that the network would likely collapse. It was designed around human logistics software and human operational methods. The Therians could maintain it for a while if they followed the procedures exactly, but any disruption would cascade through the entire system. Vexen wanted to know why the humans had not trained Therian replacements. Karen reminded him that they had tried, multiple times over multiple years, but Council species kept reassigning the trainees to other duties. They had never taken the training seriously, because they assumed humans would always be there to handle the difficult work. The warehouse grew quiet as the last human workers finished their tasks. Karen handed Vexen a data crystal containing all the operational procedures and access codes. She wished him luck. Vexen accepted the crystal with trembling hands. He thanked Karen for her service and admitted that he had never properly appreciated how much humans did to keep everything running. Karen smiled sadly and said that perhaps the Council would learn that lesson now. Back on Earth, President Helen Carter stood before the United Human Assembly in Geneva. The chamber was filled with representatives from every nation and colony in human space. The decision to withdraw from the Council had been unanimous among human leadership, but it still needed to be explained to the public. Helen spoke with the calm authority that had made her one of the most respected leaders in human history. She explained that humanity had entered the Galactic Council with hope and good faith. They had given everything asked of them and more. They had lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers defending Council worlds. They had shared their technology and knowledge freely. They had tried to be good partners, but partnership required mutual respect. The Council had made it clear through 15 years of delays and dismissals that they would never see humanity as equals. They viewed humans as useful servants, nothing more, continuing to accept that treatment would have damaged humanity's soul more than any war ever could. Helen's voice grew stronger as she spoke about dignity and self-determination. Humanity would not beg for respect from those unwilling to give it. They would chart their own course among the stars. The galaxy was vast. There was room for humanity to grow and thrive without the Council's approval. The Assembly rose in unanimous support. The decision had been made. Humanity was walking away. In the Council chambers on Zarathus Prime, emergency sessions stretched late into the night. Councillor Drek stood before his colleagues, insisting that this was merely a negotiating tactic. Humans were emotional and impulsive. They would realize their mistake and come back begging to rejoin. The Council simply needed to wait, but a few councillors were not so sure. Liz of Etheria, one of the younger members, pointed out that humans had never bluffed before. When they made a commitment, they kept it. When they made a threat, they followed through. Perhaps the Council had misjudged the situation. Drex dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand. The Council had endured for thousands of years before humanity arrived. They would endure for thousands more after humanity left. Humans needed the Council far more than the Council needed humans. The emergency session ended with no resolution. Most councillors went home believing that the crisis would resolve itself. Only a few lay awake wondering if they had just made a terrible mistake. The withdrawal continued. 3 months had passed since the last human ship departed from Council space. The Galactic Council had settled into an uneasy routine, trying to fill the gaps left by humanity's absence. Most councillors still believed the situation was temporary. They expected humans to return once they realized how much they needed the Council's protection and trade networks. Councillor Drex repeated this sentiment at every opportunity, his voice filled with the confidence of someone who had never been proven wrong. Then the Kraith attacked. The assault came at dawn on the fortress world of Kellis IV. Kraith warships dropped out of hyperspace in a formation that suggested months of planning. Their fleet was 3 times larger than any force they had deployed during the war. Clearly, they had been rebuilding their strength while waiting for the right moment to strike. The departure of human forces had given them that moment. The Council Defense Fleet station near Kellis IV consisted of 12 ships from various member species. The fleet commander was a Therian named Gethox, who had earned his position through decades of bureaucratic maneuvering rather than combat experience. He had never actually fought the Kraith. During the war, human forces had handled most of the real fighting while Council fleets provided support from safer positions. Gethox stared at his tactical display in horror as the Kraith fleet closed in. He ordered his ships to form a defensive perimeter, using the standard Council formation that had been taught at the Academy for centuries. The formation looked impressive in simulations. Against the Kraith, it lasted less than 10 minutes. The Kraith had learned to fight humans during the war. Human tactics emphasized speed, unpredictability, and aggressive counterattacks. The rigid Council formations were exactly what the Kraith hoped to face. They tore through Gethox's defensive line like it was made of paper. 5 Council ships were destroyed in the opening engagement. The rest scattered in panic. Gethox sent desperate messages to Council Command requesting reinforcements. The response came hours later after passing through multiple levels of bureaucracy. Reinforcements would be dispatched as soon as the proper authorization forms were completed and filed. Gethox wanted to scream. By the time the paperwork was finished, Kellis IV would have fallen. On the planet's surface, Torvin and his fellow Kellians huddled in shelters as Kraith bombardment began. The defensive systems that human engineers had installed still functioned, but without trained operators, they were far less effective. The automated targeting protocols did their best, but the Kraith quickly identified and exploited the weaknesses in the programming. Torvin thought about Lieutenant Amy Foster and the other humans who had protected his world. He wondered if they knew what was happening. He wondered if they cared. Part of him was angry that humans had abandoned them. Another part understood that the Council had brought this on themselves. The Kellians were simply caught in the middle of a situation they had not created and could not control. The Kraith ground forces landed 3 days later. The Council reinforcements were still in transit, delayed by coordination problems between different species fleets. Kellis IV fell without much resistance. The population was enslaved according to Kraith custom. Torvin was among those taken. As Kraith soldiers forced him onto a transport ship, he looked up at the sky and saw the stars that had once promised hope and connection. Now they seemed cold and distant. Far from Kellis IV, other problems were emerging across Council space. The early warning network that monitored the borders for enemy activity had gone dark in several sectors. The network was a complex system that integrated sensors from dozens of different species technologies. Human technicians had maintained it because they were the only ones who fully understood how all the pieces fit together. Chief Engineer Danny Price sat in his office on Earth, reviewing the desperate messages that arrived daily from Council space. His former Therian counterpart had sent 17 requests for help in the past week alone. The Therian engineer had the technical documentation, but documentation alone was not enough. The system required intuitive understanding that came from years of hands-on experience. Danny composed a reply explaining the basics of network maintenance. He included detailed instructions and even recorded video guides. But he knew it would not be enough. The Council engineers lacked the foundational knowledge to troubleshoot problems when things went wrong. And things always went wrong with systems this complex. Without the early warning network, the Council was flying blind. Kraith forces moved freely through the unmonitored sectors. By the time Council forces detected them, it was too late to respond effectively. On Velorn Prime, the plague that Dr. Paul Chen had been studying spread to a new continent. The Valorian government declared a state of emergency. Scientists worked frantically to replicate the progress that Paul's team had made, but they struggled to understand the unconventional approaches humans had taken. Human medical research combined insights from biology, chemistry, physics, and even social sciences in ways that seemed chaotic to traditional Valorian methods. Corvus, the elderly Valorian scientist who had worked with Paul, found himself leading the research effort. He studied the files Paul had left behind, trying to decode the logic behind each experiment. Some of it made sense after careful analysis. Other parts remained mysterious. The humans had intuitive leaps in their reasoning that Corvus could see but not reproduce. The death toll from the plague climbed steadily. Each day brought hundreds of new casualties. Corvus worked until exhaustion forced him to rest, then returned to the lab after a few hours of fitful sleep. He understood now what Paul had tried to tell him. Having the data was not the same as understanding the thinking behind it. Trade routes that had connected Council worlds for generations began to collapse. Human merchant ships had served as neutral carriers between species that harbored old grudges against each other. The Korthaxi and the Prelians had fought a bitter war 2 centuries ago. Neither species would allow the other's ships into their territory. Human vessels had bridged that gap, carrying goods between the two civilizations and making profitable trade possible. With humans gone, the old animosities resurfaced. The Korthaxi refused to deal with Prelian merchants. The Prelians responded with their own restrictions. Trade between dozens of worlds ground to a halt. Prices for basic goods skyrocketed. Shortages appeared in sectors that had not experienced scarcity in living memory. The diplomatic situation deteriorated as well. Humans had served as mediators in countless disputes between Council species. They had a gift for finding compromise solutions that satisfied everyone involved. Human arbitrators were seen as fair because they had no stake in ancient rivalries that predated their species' existence in space. Without human mediation, disputes escalated quickly. The Valorns and the Therians nearly went to war over a trade disagreement that involved a single mining station. The argument was petty and both sides knew it, but neither would back down without losing face. In the past, a human arbitrator would have found a solution within an afternoon. Now the dispute dragged on for weeks with both sides massing military forces. Council meetings became increasingly chaotic. The younger councilors demanded action. They argued that the council needed to negotiate humanity's return immediately. Elder councilors like Drex refused to admit that removing humanity had been a mistake. They insisted that the current problems were temporary growing pains. The council had endured for millennia before humans arrived. They would adapt and overcome. Councillor Liss of Etheria stood before the assembly and presented a detailed analysis of humanity's contributions over the past 15 years. The numbers were staggering. Humans had provided 73% of frontline combat forces during the Kraith War. Human technology had increased council fleet effectiveness by 200%. Human logistics networks had prevented famines on 6 different planets. Human medical advances had saved over 40 billion lives across council worlds. Drex dismissed the analysis as exaggerated. He suggested that Liss was too young to understand the broader historical context. The council had survived countless crises over thousands of years. This was merely another challenge to overcome. Liss responded with barely controlled anger. History would not save them if they refused to learn from their mistakes. The council was failing because they had taken humanity for granted. The argument continued for hours without resolution. The council remained divided. Meanwhile, the Kraith continued their advance. More worlds fell. More supply lines collapsed. More people died from plague and starvation and war. On Earth, President Helen Carter watched the situation unfold through intelligence reports. Her advisors were divided on how to respond. Some argued that humanity should offer assistance despite the Council's past treatment. Others insisted that the Council needed to learn this lesson fully before any reconciliation could occur. Helen made no immediate decision. She would wait and watch. Humanity had walked away to reclaim their dignity. They would not rush back at the first sign of trouble. The Council had chosen this path. Now they would have to walk it and face the consequences of their arrogance. In Council space, the cracks in their civilization grew wider with each passing day. 6 months after humanity's departure, the Kraith launched their most ambitious attack yet. A massive battle fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of Council territory and began a direct advance toward Zarathus Prime itself. The capital world of the Galactic Council had not faced a military threat in over 1,000 years. Its defenses were impressive on paper, but had never been tested in actual combat. The Council's military command scrambled to organize a response. Ships were pulled from defensive positions across known space. Species that had not fought together since the end of the Kraith War tried to coordinate their efforts through communication channels that no longer had human translators to smooth over the differences in military terminology and tactical doctrine. Confusion spread faster than coherent orders. The Council Defense Fleet assembled near Zarathus Prime with nearly 200 ships from a dozen different species. It should have been more than enough to repel the Kraith attack, but the fleet was a collection of individual units rather than a unified force. Each species operated according to their own procedures and chain of command. When the Kraith engaged them, the Council fleet responded like a crowd rather than an army. The battle lasted less than 8 hours. The Kraith had studied Council tactics during the war and knew exactly how to exploit the lack of coordination. They focused their fire on communication ships first, cutting the links between different parts of the Council fleet. Without communication, the various species' forces fought as isolated groups. The Kraith surrounded and destroyed them one by one. By nightfall on Zarathus Prime, the Kraith controlled the space around the planet. Their bombardment began immediately. Weapons that had destroyed fortified military positions on other worlds now turned their fury on civilian population centers. Millions of beings ran for shelter as the sky lit up with fire. In the Council chambers deep beneath the planet's surface, emergency meetings devolved into chaos. Councilors shouted accusations at each other. Some blamed the military commanders for incompetence. Others blamed the species whose ships had retreated first. Drex tried to maintain order, but his voice was lost in the noise. The veneer of civilization that had held the council together for millennia was cracking under pressure. Counselor Liss pushed her way to the center of the chamber and activated the emergency broadcast system. Her voice cut through the chaos. She said there was only one option left. They needed to contact Earth and beg for help. Several counselors immediately objected. Drex said that asking humans for help would be admitting they had been wrong. It would give humanity too much power over the council. Liss turned on Drex with fury in her eyes. She asked if his pride was worth millions of civilian lives. The Kraith were about to destroy the capital of galactic civilization, and all Drex could think about was maintaining his political position. She called him a coward and a fool. Other counselors began to side with Liss. The vote was called. The motion to request human assistance passed by a narrow margin. The message was sent through secure channels directly to Earth. It was brief and desperate. The council was facing destruction. Millions of civilians were trapped on Zarathus Prime. The council formally requested immediate military assistance from humanity. The message ended with something the council had never offered before: a genuine apology. President Helen Carter received the message in the middle of the night. She convened an emergency meeting of her cabinet and military leadership. The room was divided from the start. Admiral Scott Hayes argued loudly that humanity had no obligation to save those who had treated them with contempt for 15 years. The council had made their choice. Let them live with the consequences. But General Kate Morrison, younger sister of Captain Jake Morrison, disagreed. She said the council leadership deserved what was happening to them, but the civilians on Zarathus Prime did not. Millions of innocent people were about to die because their leaders were arrogant fools. Humanity had always stood for protecting the innocent. That principle did not change based on whether people respected them or not. The debate continued for hours. Helen listened to every argument, her face grave. Finally, she made her decision. Humanity would respond to the council's request, but not in the way they expected. Human forces would not fight the Kraith. They would evacuate as many civilians as possible from Zarathus Prime. This was a humanitarian mission, not a military intervention. The council had to learn that humanity's help came on human terms. Captain Jake Morrison received his orders while the Endeavour was docked at a resupply station near Mars. He was to take a fleet of 30 ships to Zarathus Prime immediately. The mission was simple in concept but dangerous in execution. Get in, save as many civilians as possible, and get out. Avoid engaging the Kraith unless absolutely necessary. Jake read the orders twice to make sure he understood correctly. They were going to fly into a war zone, ignore the enemy fleet, and focus entirely on rescue operations. It was the most audacious mission he had ever been given. The human fleet arrived at Zarathus Prime 72 hours after receiving the distress call. The tactical situation was worse than the intelligence report suggested. The Kraith had complete control of orbital space. Their ships surrounded the planet like predators circling wounded prey. The bombardment had intensified. Entire cities were burning. Jake stood on the bridge of the Endeavour and studied the tactical display. His officers waited for orders. The Kraith fleet had certainly detected their arrival. The enemy ships were moving to intercept. Jake gave the order to ignore them and proceed directly to the planet. His fleet would rely on superior shields and maneuvering to avoid engagement. The mission was civilian evacuation, nothing else. The human ships dove toward the planet at speeds that would have torn apart most council vessels. Advanced inertial dampeners kept the crews safe, as the ships performed maneuvers that seemed to defy physics. The Kraith fleet tried to intercept, but human vessels were faster and more agile. They slipped through the enemy formation like water flowing around rocks. Lieutenant Amy Foster was aboard one of the transport ships in Jake's fleet. She had volunteered immediately when she heard about the mission. Now she watched through the viewport as they descended through smoke-filled skies toward a burning city. She could see masses of people crowded in the streets below, looking up at the sky with desperate hope. The human ships activated their advanced teleportation systems. These were new devices that combined human engineering with technology. Humanity had developed independently after leaving the Council. The systems could transport hundreds of people at a time, directly from the surface to the ships. Council species had never developed anything comparable Because their various technologies had never been properly integrated, Amy coordinated the rescue efforts in her sector. The teleportation system locked onto life signs below and began extraction. Beings materialized in the cargo holds of her ship by the hundreds. Kellians, Valorns, Therians, Prelians, and dozens of other species appeared in flashes of light. They looked around in confusion and fear. Amy and her team moved among them, offering water and medical attention, speaking calmly to ease their terror. The evacuation continued for 18 hours straight. The Kraith fleet kept trying to interfere but seemed confused by humanity's tactics. Human ships would appear in one location, evacuate thousands of civilians, then disappear before the Kraith could react. It was not the stand-up fight the Kraith expected. The humans were not trying to win a battle. They were simply saving lives. One of the civilians brought aboard the Endeavor was Counselor Drex himself. He materialized in a cargo hold along with his family and dozens of other Valorns. Jake Morrison happened to be inspecting that section of the ship when Drex arrived. The two stood facing each other for a long moment. Drex opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could he possibly say? His pride had nearly cost him everything. His family stood behind him, alive only because humans had risked their lives to save them. Jake simply nodded at the Valorian counselor and moved on. There would be time for words later. Right now there were more people to save. As the human fleet prepared to depart, the Kraith made one final attempt to stop them. A squadron of Kraith warships moved to block the escape route. For a moment it seemed like combat would be unavoidable. Then the Kraith ships suddenly broke off their attack and retreated to a safe distance. They had realized something important. The human fleet had been focused entirely on evacuation. Not a single human weapon had been fired in anger, but the Kraith could see the weapons the human ships carried. They could detect the power signatures of systems far more advanced than anything they had encountered before. The Kraith had learned to fear human military capability during the war. Now they saw a human fleet that had entered their controlled space, ignored their threats, and accomplished its mission without even bothering to fight. The message was clear. Humans could have engaged and possibly destroyed the Kraith fleet. They had chosen not to, because they had more important things to do. That display of capability and restraint was more intimidating than any battle could have been. The human fleet jumped to hyperspace, carrying over 3 million rescued civilians. Behind them, Zorathis Prime continued to burn. The rescued civilians from Zorathis Prime were transported to human stations throughout Earth's solar system. Medical teams worked around the clock treating injuries and providing care. The refugees were given food, shelter, and safety while the Galactic Council tried to figure out what to do next. Among those refugees were 47 council members and their families, including Counselor Drex. Drex spent his first week at a human station in orbit around Mars. He shared living quarters with dozens of other Valorns who had lost everything when Zorathis Prime fell. The accommodations were basic but clean and comfortable. Human staff treated everyone with professional courtesy regardless of species or status. Drex found himself standing in line for meals alongside common citizens. No one gave him special treatment because of his council position. It was humbling in ways he had not expected. On his 8th day at the station, Drex was invited to observe the Human Rescue Operations Center. He watched as coordinators managed the care of 3 million refugees spread across multiple facilities. The efficiency was remarkable. Every person was tracked, every need was addressed, and the entire system ran smoothly despite the enormous logistical challenge. Drex realized that humans had planned for this kind of mass rescue operation. They had the infrastructure and training ready before the crisis even happened. A young human officer named Lieutenant Amy Foster gave Drex a tour of the medical facilities. He recognized her after a moment. She had served on Kellis IV before the withdrawal. Drex remembered reading her reports about her work with the local population. He asked if she was angry about what had happened to the Kellians. Amy's expression remained neutral, but her eyes showed pain. She said that anger would not help anyone. What mattered now was making sure the same thing did not happen to others. Drex wanted to apologize, but the words stuck in his throat. Amy seemed to sense his struggle. She told him that actions spoke louder than words. If he truly regretted what the council had done, he should work to change it. Then she excused herself to return to her duties. Drex stood alone in the corridor, feeling smaller than he had in centuries. Back on what remained of Zorathis Prime, Counselor Liss worked with other surviving council members to establish a temporary government. The Kraith had withdrawn after the human rescue operation, apparently uncertain how to proceed. Their goal had been to destroy the council's leadership and break their will to resist. But humanity had prevented that outcome by saving the council members and millions of civilians. Liss called for a formal investigation into everything that had led to the current crisis. The younger council members supported her. The elder members who remained tried to resist, but they had lost their moral authority. The investigation began immediately, and the findings were damning. The evidence showed that humanity had provided the vast majority of combat power during the Kraith War. Human forces had fought in 73% of all major engagements. Human technology had improved Council fleet effectiveness by over 200%. Human logistics had prevented catastrophic supply failures on hundreds of occasions. Human medical advances had saved more than 40 billion lives across Council space. Human diplomatic efforts had prevented at least a dozen conflicts between Council species from escalating to violence. The investigation revealed something even more disturbing. Several elder council members, including Drex, had deliberately suppressed reports about humanity's contributions. They had edited military assessments to minimize human achievements. They had blocked proposals to give humans more authority. They had done everything possible to keep humanity in a subordinate position because they feared what would happen if humans gained real power in the council. When the full report was released, public opinion across council space turned sharply against the elder leadership. Citizens who had lost loved ones in the recent disasters wanted accountability. Species that had relied on human protection and support demanded answers about why humanity had been driven away. The pressure became impossible to ignore. A vote of no confidence was called. Drex and 6 other elder counselors were removed from their positions. New elections were scheduled. Counselor Liss was appointed as temporary head of the council, with a mandate to reform its structure and policies. Her first official act was to draft a formal apology to humanity. The document was not a simple political statement. It was a detailed acknowledgement of every way the council had failed humanity. It admitted that humans had been treated as servants rather than partners. It recognized that human sacrifices had saved the council from destruction during the war. It accepted full responsibility for driving humanity away through arrogance and prejudice. The apology ended with an unprecedented offer. Humanity was invited to return as full members of the Galactic Council with immediate voting rights. They would be given a permanent seat on the Security Directorate, with veto power over military operations. A formal alliance treaty would be negotiated on terms of complete equality. The Council committed to fundamental reforms that would prevent any species from being marginalized in the future. The apology and offer were transmitted to Earth through every available channel. Then the Council waited for humanity's response. Days passed with no word from Earth. Some counselors grew anxious. Others worried that humanity would reject the offer outright. Liss remained patient. She understood that humans needed time to consider such an important decision. President Helen Carter read the Council's message multiple times. She discussed it with her advisors, with military leadership, and with representatives from every human colony and nation. The debate was intense. Some argued that humanity should reject the offer and continue on their independent path. Others believed this was an opportunity to reshape galactic civilization for the better. Helen made her decision after consulting with Captain Jake Morrison, whose actions at Zarathus Prime had demonstrated the best of human values. She would accept the Council's offer, but with strict conditions. The Council had to follow through on their promised reforms. Young species had to be given real pathways to power and influence. Military operations had to be conducted with proper coordination and respect for all participants. And most importantly, every species in the Council had to be treated as equal partners regardless of age or power. Helen traveled to Zarathus Prime herself to deliver humanity's response. She stood before the assembled Council in a temporary chamber built from the ruins of the old one. Her speech was broadcast across the galaxy. She said that humanity did not want subordination or domination. Humans wanted partnership between equals. They wanted a council where every species had a voice and every voice was heard with respect. She accepted the Council's offer of full membership on the condition that real reforms were implemented immediately. The Council agreed unanimously. For the first time in its long history, the Galactic Council began to change its fundamental structure to be more inclusive and democratic. Captain Jake Morrison was appointed as the first human member of the Security Directorate. His experience and proven judgment made him the obvious choice. He accepted the position with the understanding that he would advocate for fairness and competence over politics and tradition. Dr. Paul Chen returned to Valorn Prime to continue his plague research. This time he led a truly collaborative team that included scientists from multiple species working as equals. Within 6 months, they developed a cure that saved millions of lives. Paul made sure the credit was shared among all team members. Lieutenant Amy Foster volunteered to lead a joint human and Council military force to retake Kellis 4. The operation was carefully planned with input from all participating species. When the combined fleet arrived at Kellis 4, they found the Kraith had already abandoned the world. The enemy had learned that fighting the Council with human support was very different from fighting the fractured organization they had faced before. Torvin and the other enslaved Kellians were freed during the liberation of a Kraith prison facility. When Torvin stepped off the transport ship back on his homeworld, Amy was there to meet him. The reunion was emotional. Torvin thanked her for keeping her promise. Amy reminded him that humans remembered their friends, always. 1 year after the crisis at Zorathus Prime, the reformed Galactic Council held its first full assembly under the new structure. Representatives from over 100 species filled the chamber. The younger species had real voting power now. The ancient hierarchies had been dismantled. Decisions were made through genuine debate and consensus rather than the dictates of elder members. Councillor Liss, now formally elected to lead the council, opened the session with a reflection on the past year. She said that losing humanity had been the best thing that could have happened to the council. It had forced them to confront their arrogance and recognize what they had taken for granted. Sometimes you only learned the value of something when it walked away. Jake Morrison sat in the human delegation section listening to Liss speak. After the session ended, she approached him privately. She admitted that she had been terrified when humans announced their withdrawal. At the time, she thought it would destroy everything. Now she understood that it had saved everything. The council needed to be broken before it could be rebuilt properly. Jake smiled and said that humanity had not walked away to teach the council a lesson. They had walked away to reclaim their dignity. Humans could not continue serving those who refused to respect them, but he was glad that something good had come from the crisis. That was what humans did. They tried to make things better even when it cost them. Liss asked what had made humans different from other species. What allowed them to sacrifice so much while asking for so little in return? Jake thought about the question for a moment. He said it was probably because humans remembered what it was like to struggle. Earth had not been an easy world. Humanity had fought for everything they achieved. They understood that strength without compassion was just cruelty. Power without responsibility was just tyranny. The conversation ended with a handshake between human and Etherian. It was a simple gesture, but it symbolized the new relationship between humanity and the Council. Partners walking forward together as equals. The war against the Kraith continued, but now the Council fought as a unified force. Human tactical expertise combined with Council resources and the determination of dozens of species. The enemy that had nearly destroyed galactic civilization found itself facing an opponent far stronger than before. In the years that followed, the Galactic Council would face many challenges, but they would face them together with humanity as true partners. The Council had learned its lesson the hard way. Respect could not be demanded or taken. It had to be earned and given freely. Humanity had taught them that truth by walking away when their dignity was compromised. And in learning that lesson, the Council had become something better than it had been in thousands of years of existence.